This is Chapter 19 for U.S. History. The first question is, by 1946, how many men and women were released from World War II? You have returned home from serving in World War II to find that your country is changing. The cities have swelled. Outlying suburbs are being built up with almost identical homes. America produces more and cheaper goods. In a booming economy, couples marry and start families in record numbers. As you watch clever ads on TV for the newest labor savings gadgets, you feel nostalgia for a simpler time. What is the American dream of the 1950s? Examine the issues. How does pressure to conform affect the American dream? Who might be excluded from the new prosperity? How does advertising promote certain lifestyle ideals? Main idea: the Truman and Eisenhower administration led the nation to make social, economic, and political adjustments following World War II. Why it matters now. In the year after World War II, the United States became the economic and military power that it is still today. And here are your terms. One American story. Sam Gordon had been married less than a year when he was shipped overseas in July 1943. As a sergeant in the United States Army, he fought in Belgium and France during World War II. Arriving back home in November 1945, Sam nervously anticipated a reunion with his family. A friend, Donald Katz, describes Sam's reactions. A personal voice. Donald Katz. Sam bowled through the crowd and hailed a taxi. The cab motored north through the warm autumn day as he groped for feelings appropriate to being back home alive from a terrible war. He was nearly panting under the weight of fear. Back home alive, married to a girl I haven't seen since 1943. Father of a child I've never seen at all. Home fires. Sam Gordon met his daughter Susan for the first time the day he returned home from the war, and he went to work the next morning. Like many other young couples, the Gordons began to put the nightmare of the war behind them and return to normality. GIs returned home to their families after World War II with new hope, but also with new problems: readjustment and recovery. By the summer of 1946, about 10 million men and women had been released from the armed forces. Veterans like Sam Gordon, along with the rest of American society, settled down to rebuild their lives. This is number 1 on your study guide. The impact of the GI Bill. So what did the GI Bill of the Rights promise to people while job hunting? This is number 2 on the study guide. In 1944, in addition to encouraging veterans to get an education by paying part of their tuition, the GI Bill guaranteed them a year's worth of unemployment benefits while job hunting. So again, number 2. It also offered low-interest, federally guaranteed loans. Millions of young families used these benefits to buy homes and farms or to establish businesses. Number 3, what method did Leavitt use to construct homes in the suburbs? Housing crisis. In 1945 and 46, returning veterans faced a severe housing shortage. Many families lived in cramped apartments or moved in with relatives. In response to this housing crisis, developers like William Leavitt and Henry Kaiser used efficient assembly line methods to mass-produce houses. Leavitt, who bragged that his company should build a house in 60 minutes, offered homes in small residential communities surrounding cities called suburbs for less than $7,000. So we're on number 3 now. Leavitt's first post-war development, Rosa's standardized homes built on treeless lots, was located on New York Long Island and named Levittown. These homes looked exactly alike, and certain zoning laws ensured that they would stay the same. Despite their rigid conformity, Americans loved the openness and small-town feeling to the planned suburbs. With the help of the GI Bill, many veterans and their families moved in and cultivated a new lifestyle. So the question asks, what method did Leavitt use to construct homes in the suburbs? Okay, so it's right there in that section. Question number 4. What were many women reluctant to give up after World War II? The suburbs were a mass phenomenon, even on moving day, redefining the family. Tensions created by changes in men's and women's roles after the war contributed to a rising divorce rate. Traditionally, men were the breadwinners and head of household, while women were expected to stay home and care for the family. During the war, however, about 8 million women, 75% of whom were married, entered the paid workforce. These women supported their families and made important household decisions. Many were reluctant to give up their newfound independence when their husbands returned. Although most women did leave their jobs, by 1950 more than 1 million war marriages had ended in divorce. Economic readjustment. After World War II, the United States converted from a war. Okay, so let's go back. So, what were women reluctant to give up after World War II? Work. So they had been used to working outside the home, and now they were expected to stay home. Okay, so let's look at number 5. Within 10 days after World War II, how many defense contractors were laid off and why? After World War II, the United States converted from a wartime to a peacetime economy. The U.S. government immediately canceled war contracts totaling $35 billion. Within 10 days of Japan's surrender, more than 1 million defense workers were laid off. Unemployment increased as veterans joined laid off defense workers in the search for jobs at the peak of post-war unemployment. In March 1946, nearly 3 million people were seeking work. Rising unemployment was not the nation's only post-war economic problem, however. During the war, the Office of Price Administration, OPA, had halted inflation by imposing maximum prices on goods. When these controls ended on June 30th, 1946, prices skyrocketed. In the next 2 weeks, the cost of consumer products soared 25%, double the increase of the previous 3 years. In some cities, consumers stood in long lines hoping to buy scarce items such as sugar, coffee, and beans. Prices continued to rise for the next 2 years until the supply of goods caught up with the demand. Let's go back to the study guide. Within 10 days after World War II, how many defense contractors were laid off and why? Okay, so let me go back. Within 10 days of Japan's surrender, more than 1 million defense workers were laid off. Okay, so let's go back. During the Cold War, what kind of spending kept people employed? So this is the rising unemployment. Cost of consumer products soared 25%, double the increase. Some cities' consumers stood in long lines. Prices continue to rise. But prices spiraled upward. Many American workers also earned less. Congress eventually established controls similar to. Okay, so let's get to this one. So during the Cold War, what kind of spending kept people employed? Most economists had forecast a post-war depression were proved wrong because they had failed to consider consumers' pent-up accumulation of needs and wants. People had gone without many goods for so long that by the late 1940s, with more than $135 billion in savings from defense work, service pay, and investments in war bonds, Americans suddenly had money to spend. Okay, they snatched up everything from automobiles to houses. After a brief period of post-war economic adjustment, the American economy boomed. The demand for goods and services outstripped the supply and increased production, which created new jobs. Judging from the graph, many Americans prospered in the 1950s in what the economist John Kenneth Galbraith called the affluent society. So with our question, it says, during the Cold War, what kind of spending kept people employed? I don't know if that really answers that or not, so we'll keep going. From the 1950s to 1960s, by what percentage did each of economic indicators show above increase? Which year shows the biggest increase for each of the graphs above? The Cold War also contributed to economic growth. Here we go. Concern over Soviet expansion kept American defense spending high and people employed. Okay, so concerns over Soviet expansion kept American defense spending high and people employed. So that's our Cold War question number 6. Number 7, in 1946, what laws did Truman try to pass having to do with civil rights? How did Congress respond? So civil rights, 1946. Okay. Harry S. Truman suddenly became president after Franklin D. Roosevelt's death in 1945. He asked Roosevelt's widow, Eleanor, whether there was anything he could do for her. She replied, "Is there anything we can do for you? For you are the one in trouble now." In many ways, President Truman was in trouble. A personal voice. Harry S. Truman, I don't know whether you fellows ever had a load of hay fall on you, but when they told me yesterday what had happened, Roosevelt's death, I felt like the moon, the stars, and all the planets had fallen on me. Despite his lack of preparation for the job, Truman was widely viewed as honorable, down to earth, and self-confident. Most important of all, he had the ability to make difficult decisions, to accept full responsibility for their consequences. As the plaque on his White House desk read, or plaque, the buck stops here. Truman faced two huge challenges: dealing with the rising threat of communism, as discussed in Chapter 18, and restoring the American economy to a strong footing after the war's end. Truman faces strikes. One economic problem that Truman had to address was strikes, facing higher prices and lower wages. 5 million discontented workers, including steel workers, coal miners, and railroad workers, went on strike in 46. Although he generally supported organized labor, Truman refused to let strikes cripple the nation. He threatened to draft the striking workers and to order them as soldiers to stay on the job. He authorized the federal government to seize the mines, and he threatened to take control of the railroads as well. Truman appeared before Congress and asked for the authority to draft the striking railroad workers into the Army before he could finish his speech the Union gave him. Okay. Let's see. Main idea. What actions did he take for the labor strike? So if you want to read about the labor strike, you'll read it there. And then here's some information about Jackie Robinson. You know that Jackie Robinson was one of the African American famous baseball players who were able to break the barrier of into the major league. And then this is, we're down here, Truman supports civil rights. So now we're looking at number 7. Truman puts his presidency on line for civil rights. I am asking for equality of opportunity for all human beings, he said, and if that ends up in my failure to be reelected, that failure will be in a good cause. In 1946, Truman created a President's Commission of Civil Rights. Following the group's recommendation, Truman asked Congress for several measures, including a federal anti-lynching law, a ban on the poll taxes, voting requirements, and a permanent Civil Rights Commission. Okay, so that's the first part of the question. So how did Congress respond? Congress refused to pass these measures or a measure to integrate the armed forces. As a result, Truman himself took action. In July 1948, he issued an executive order for integration of the armed forces, calling for equality of treatment and opportunity in the armed forces without regard to race, color, religion, or national origin. In addition, he ordered an end to discrimination in the hiring of government employees. The Supreme Court also ruled that the lower courts could not bar African Americans from residential neighborhoods. These actions represented the beginning of a federal commitment to dealing with racial issues. Okay, number 8. Who won the 1948 presidential election? What policies did he pass soon after? Okay, let's get, this is, okay, 48 election. Although many Americans blamed Truman for the nation's inflation and labor unrest, the Democrats nominated him for president in 1948. To protest Truman's emphasis on civil rights, a number of Southern Democrats, who became known as Dixiecrats, formed the state's Rights Democratic Party and nominated their own presidential candidate, Governor J. Strom Thurmond of South Carolina. Discontent reigned at the far left of the Democratic spectrum as well. The former Vice President Harry A. Wallace led his supporters out of the mainstream Democratic ranks to form a more liberal party. As the election approached, opinion polls gave the Republican candidate Dewey a comfortable lead. Refusing to believe the polls, Truman poured his energy into the campaign. First, he called the Republican-dominated Congress into a special session. He challenged it to pass laws supporting such elements of the Democratic Party platform as public housing, federal aid to education, a higher minimum wage, and extended social security coverage. Not one of these laws was passed. Then he took his campaign to the people. He traveled from one end of the country to the other by train, speaking from the rear platform in a sweeping whistle-stop campaign. Day after day, people heard the president denounce the do-nothing 80th Congress. Stunning upset. Truman's give 'em hell, Harry campaign worked. He won the election in a close political upset. The Democrats gained control of Congress as well, even though they suffered losses in the South, which have been solidly Democratic since Reconstruction. So that's number 8. And then number 9, what did Eisenhower's government call for? Okay, so let's see. Okay, Truman surprised the newspapers by winning the 48 election. More about Truman, and we're looking for Eisenhower. So let's scroll down a little bit. Republicans take the middle road. Despite these social and economic victories, Truman's approval rating sank to an all-time low of 23% in 51. The stalemate in the Korean War and the rising tide of McCarthyism, which cast doubt on the loyalty of some federal employees, became overwhelming issues. Truman decided not to run for re-election. The Democrats nominated the intellectual and articulate Governor Adlai Stevenson of Illinois to run against the Republican candidate Eisenhower, known as Ike. Okay, so it says, what did Eisenhower government call for? In quotes. Okay, so he was called Ike. I like Ike. During the campaign, the Republicans accused the Democrats of plunder at home and blunder abroad. Okay, so what did Eisenhower's government call for? To fan the anti-communist hysteria that was sweeping over the country, Republicans raised the specter of the rise of communism in China and Eastern Europe. They also criticized the growing power of the federal government and alleged bribery and corruption among Truman's political allies. Campaign accessories expressed Ike's popularity and voters' desire for a positive political change. Eisenhower's campaign hit a snag, and however, when newspapers accused his running mate, California Senator Richard M. Nixon, of profiting from a secret slush fund set up by wealthy supporters, Nixon decided to reply to the charges in an emotional speech to an audience of 58 million, now known as the Checkers speech. He exhibited masterful use of a new medium, television. Nixon denied any wrongdoing, but he did admit to accepting one gift from a political supporter. Okay, so let's see. President Eisenhower's style of governing different from that of Democrats. His approach, which he called dynamic conservatism, was also known as modern republicanism. He called for a government to be conservative when it comes to money and liberal when it comes to human beings. So I believe for number 9, what did Eisenhower government call for? Conservative when it comes to money and liberal when it comes to human beings. So this is the 19.1 post-war America for U.S. history. So please try to get your, do your terms, and then also get these questions written out and completed and turned in to your teacher, okay? All right, I'll see you guys. Bye.